A Russian mobster just made the biggest mistake of his life, threatening a Mafia kingpin's baby, when a chilling phone call targeted Alicia and her infant daughter, Juliana. She was forced to call the one man she hated most, her ex-husband. Ricardo told her to lock the doors and arrived 12 minutes later with an armed convoy. You won't believe the terrifying lengths a monster will go to when he goes to war for his family. Picture the scene as midnight settles over the estate. The camera pushes slowly down the shadowed hallway, lingering on Alicia. She stands breathless, the heavy door cracked just enough to let a sliver of golden candlelight escape. Her hands cradle her pregnant belly, trembling with innocent joy, holding his favorite wine and a fresh ultrasound. But then, the audio drops. A stranger's giggle bleeds through the wood, tangling with the low rumble of her husband. You and I have watched this exact tragedy unfold before. She pushes the door open, and in one brutal heartbeat, her fairy tale burns to ash. The flickering light exposes a betrayal so profound it shatters her reality. We eventually learn a harsh truth. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the very ones holding the matches. The audacity of the frame suffocates the midnight air. A stranger is draped across Milan's most feared boss. The lighting shifts as Ricardo locks eyes with his wife. The visual irony is deafening. The words "family above all" are tattooed across his neck, a mark that now mocks Alicia. Most would collapse right there, screaming in agony. But watch her posture carefully. Alicia goes entirely numb. She stares down this terrifying king of the underworld, a man whose violent hands have crushed empires. Gripping her stomach, she swallows the sickening reality. No tears fall. No rage explodes. She simply turns her back and walks away. True strength is not always loud. Often, the absolute most powerful reaction to a deep betrayal is a freezing, unbroken silence. Let us pull focus back to the suffocating tension of the hallway. Notice the sound design. Every sharp click of her heels against the marble strikes like a judge dropping a heavy gavel. With each step, she leaves her trusting self behind in the shadows. Back in the ruined bedroom, the untouchable syndicate boss is losing his grip. He curses loudly, frantically untangling himself from the silk sheets, shouting her name in raw panic. She never glances back. She stares down 23 steps of cold stone. She used to count those stairs on nights she felt like his cherished queen. Tonight, that sweeping staircase is her only escape route. The beautiful illusion is dead. Letting go of a toxic dream is agonizing, but walking away from a lie is always the first step toward finding your true worth. Those grand stairs are her only lifeline. Ricardo's voice tears through the quiet mansion, demanding her to wait. The heavy thud of his footsteps means he is closing the distance fast. Picture this ruthless boss, a man who makes hardened enforcers tremble, frantically buttoning his shirt as he chases his pregnant wife. She keeps moving, her eyes locked on the heavy front doors. Her keys rest exactly where she left them, back when she still believed his promises. Then his rough hand clamps down hard on her wrist. Look closely at the framing of this exact moment. She stops, but not because his brute strength forces her. She stops only because she allows it. Nobody can truly control you without your consent. Reclaiming your power begins the moment you refuse to be a victim of someone else's chaos. Time stretches in slow motion as she turns to face him in the dim foyer. Ricardo towers above her, a violent force of nature now completely unraveling. His famously dead eyes are wide with terror. He begs for a chance to explain, grasping at broken excuses. The camera tilts down. Alicia lowers her gaze to his hand wrapped around her wrist. She studies his knuckle tattoos, the exact ink she used to kiss in the dark safety of their bed. It all feels disgustingly cheap now. Without raising her voice, she states there is nothing left to say. Her tone is entirely empty, echoing like a ghost. In that freezing silence, the underworld king realizes his true empire is turning to ash. Words lose their meaning when actions prove them false. We must remember that shattered trust is never repaired by empty apologies. Stick with me here, because this is where the dynamic flips. Feel the suffocating silence in that foyer. She strips away his authority with one quiet truth. She tells him she saw everything. He scrambles, claiming the stranger meant nothing. Alessia cuts through his panic, asking if that changes the reality of his choice. With agonizing calm, she slowly peels his thick fingers off her wrist. He braces for a screaming match, but she merely whispers for him to stay back. Desperate, he growls that she is his wife. She replies that he just proved how utterly worthless that title truly is. When he begs, invoking the baby, she looks dead into his eyes and says, "Watch me." The heavy door clicks shut. Sometimes, the most profound boundary you can ever set is walking away without giving someone the satisfaction of your anger. Milan is stained by centuries of brutal betrayals. Yet tonight feels uniquely tragic. The camera tracks Alessia walking with grim purpose toward the car he bought for their anniversary. The bitter irony hangs heavy. Sliding into the leather seat, she realizes her hands are completely steady. That sweet girl who parked this car 90 minutes ago, clutching an ultrasound photo, died in that hallway. The hardened woman, gripping the steering wheel now, is reborn from the ashes of a shattered heart. Here is a vital truth we all need to remember. When your entire world suddenly collapses around you, you do not have to fall down with it. She presses the gas pedal hard, melting into the cinematic blur of glowing neon lights and ancient cobblestones, leaving the suffocating lies of her marriage behind in the dark. She arrives at a discreet hotel in the city center, where wealth buys absolute silence. Watch her at the front counter, making her first strike. She leaves the feared Mafia surname behind, checking in under her maiden name. In one steady breath, she sheds her label as the property of a crime family. Alone in the dimly lit suite, the camera finds her standing by the massive windows, cradling her stomach. It is a baby girl. That was the precious secret she wanted to share just 2 hours ago. Pressing her face against the cold glass, the emotional dam finally breaks. A heavy wave of grief crashes over her, yet feeling immense pain does not equal defeat. Grieving the loss of a beautiful lie is a difficult but completely necessary step toward building an honest future. And she refuses to let the sorrow drown her. Instead of letting sorrow consume her, Alessia weaponizes her pain. The lighting in the room feels stark. She examines her trauma like a detective scanning a crime scene. 3 years of a hollow marriage, 2 agonizing years praying for a child. She gave him everything only to find him tangled with a stranger. The darkest realization twists the knife deep. That woman looked entirely too comfortable. There was no genuine shock when the door opened. This was his established lifestyle. He played her for a fool, hiding his monstrous nature behind her blind devotion. It teaches us a brutal lesson. We often project our own good heart onto toxic people, completely ignoring the glaring red flags waving right in front of us. Suddenly, her phone buzzes relentlessly on the nightstand. The untouchable boss is completely unraveling. Ricardo's name flashes on the phone, glowing like a severe red hazard warning. She watches the messages pile up into frantic, aggressive demands. Finally, she presses the power button, plunging the suite into pure silence. The inevitable fallout can wait. You and I have probably both made this tragic mistake, haven't we? Ignoring our gut instincts just to protect a fragile illusion. She lies awake, analyzing the last 3 years. Those late nights at syndicate meetings were all just convenient lies. The warning signs were everywhere. She used to blame the stress of the underworld for his cruelty, convinced his twisted affection was true love. Lying in the dark, she understands a deeply painful reality. The absolute hardest step of healing is finally forgiving yourself for choosing to believe someone else's beautiful lie. Excusing his cruelty as passion was a desperate lie to protect her heart. Suddenly, a sharp kick against her ribs pulls her back to the present. Alacia presses a hand to her stomach, and for the first time tonight, fresh tears fall. Notice this crucial detail. She is not crying over a cheating mobster. Her heart is shattering for the little girl growing inside her. This innocent child will be born into the ashes of a ruined family, fathered by a ghost. In the dark room, she whispers a tearful apology to her unborn baby. Yet, as she cries, a fierce, protective resolve takes deep root in her chest. An unbreakable vow is forged right there in the shadows. We shape the next generation by the standards we refuse to lower. She will never allow her daughter to believe that enduring deep betrayal is simply the required cost of finding love. As a child, Alacia watched her mother play the tragic role of the suffering mob wife. She witnessed the slow fade of a woman who accepted disrespect to keep a fragile peace. She swore she would break that toxic generational curse. Whatever violent syndicate, war, Ricardo plans to wage to drag her back into his cage, she is fully prepared. Fast forward to daybreak. The Milan sky hangs heavy with bruised clouds. Alacia locks eyes with her reflection in the mirror. Outwardly, she looks identical to the girl who captivated the ruthless boss 3 years ago. But the soul behind her eyes has fundamentally shifted. The fragile girl who believed her pure love could fix a monster is dead. It is a harsh but necessary realization. You can never save a toxic person by simply loving them harder, but you can always save yourself by choosing to walk away. Let us look at this tragedy together, shall we? Picture the dawn light, catching the exact moment the warmth in Alacia's eyes hardens into unforgiving steel. Ricardo once worshipped that gentle gaze, viewing her as a pristine sanctuary from his violent underworld, but he brought his dirt into her temple, and now that softness is dead. Sitting in the heavy silence, she forces down dry toast solely to keep her unborn daughter alive. She turns on her screen. 47 missed calls, 32 texts. She erases his lies without blinking, but taps play on the audio. Through the tiny speaker, the untouchable crime boss is sobbing. He is desperately begging for her. The life lesson here is absolute. Those who carelessly destroy your peace will panic the very second you take back your power. The camera pushes in on her face, illuminated only by the pale blue glow of the phone in the dark. Listen to the great Riccardo Moretti. The feared syndicate leader is weeping like a shattered child. On the first track, his baritone voice violently trembles as he swears he can explain away the other woman. By the second, he desperately tries to glue his mask of authority back together, claiming his armed men are hunting for her only to protect their unborn baby. But the final message strips the king down to nothing. He confesses he is collapsed on the floor of her empty closet, clutching her silk dresses, suffocating on the lingering scent of her perfume. The lesson echoes through that dark, empty closet. You never truly understand the weight of what you possess until your own hands crush it. The agonizing sound of his weeping fills the room, yet Alacia's eyes remain totally dry. She listens exactly twice deletes the file and dials a ruthless lawyer. Cut to the stark lights of a downtown office. The attorney sits still behind a massive oak desk, his face a stone mask, when she drops the deadly name of her husband. He nods slowly, calling her Mrs. Moretti. But Alessia raises a single hand, stopping him cold. Her voice is smooth glass as she tells him she is Miss Bellini now. In that one exhaled breath, she sheds the suffocating weight of his criminal empire. The lesson here is vital. Never let a broken relationship dictate your name. Reclaiming your true identity is the very first step in taking back your life from the people who tried to bury your spirit. The attorney leans into the light, warning her of the violent storm ahead. Divorcing a syndicate boss is a deadly dance through hidden money and armed loyalists. Alessia refuses to look away. She explains how she spent the midnight hours dissecting their prenuptial agreement, hunting for a weakness. She found his fatal flaw, a strict infidelity clause that hands her the entire deck. The lawyer sits back, speechless. She does not want his blood-stained mansions or his dirty cash. She is only fighting for the absolute safety of her unborn child. Stick with me, because the lesson here is crucial. Emotional armor is a fine defense, but quiet preparation is your sharpest weapon. When handed a tragedy, study the fine print and use their own rules to walk away victorious. Watch closely as the power dynamic forever flips. Without glancing at the document, Alessia recites paragraph 47 word for perfectly articulated word. It is the exact clause stripping custody from an unfaithful partner. She rests a protective palm against her stomach, sealing a silent ironclad vow. Her daughter will never grow up in a cold mansion where betrayals are quietly swept under imported rugs. She refuses to let her child normalize broken promises. The lawyer asks if she is truly prepared to declare open war on the criminal underworld. She does not even blink her dark eyes.
She is absolutely ready.
The lesson rings profoundly true. Never settle for a partner who treats loyalty like a mere suggestion. You alone set the standard for or what your family deserves, and you fiercely defend that boundary. With the chilling calm of a tactician, Alessia declares that reconciliation is buried. The papers are signed, and the invisible war begins. For 3 days, she dissolves into the shadows of a cheap, nameless motel room, leaving Ricardo drowning in the dark. Blinded by the terrifying reality of losing her, his venomous need for control erupts. He viciously freezes every joint bank account, convinced he can break her spirit and starve her into submission. But the Mafia boss overlooked one fatal detail. He forgot the quiet inheritance left by her grandfather, money she never touched during their tragic romance. She sits in that cheap room, completely untouchable. The takeaway is crucial. Always keep a piece of your independence hidden. Financial freedom is the ultimate armor against anyone trying to cage your soul. On day 4, the panic of the abandoned king sours into violent rage. Ricardo unleashes a pack of elite attorneys to crush the divorce. Their opening move is a profound insult. They claim his affair with Valentina was a momentary lapse in judgment, entirely triggered by marital stress. Sitting on her motel bed, Alessia actually laughs. It is a dry, hollow sound echoing in the cheap room. What stress, the terrible burden of returning to a devoted wife. She knows the ugly truth. Valentina was a permanent fixture in his shadow, not a fleeting mistake. It is sickening how the guilty rewrite history. The lesson to carry with you is vital. People who betray your heart will always draft a script where they play the tragic victim. Never let anyone gaslight you into carrying the burden of their own sins. When her lawyer asks how long the betrayal has been burning, Alessia just smiles. It is a sharp, terrifying expression, proving the underworld boss is not the only one who understands war. Exactly 1 week after her illusion shattered, she marches right back to the iron gates of the Moretti estate. She is not there to offer grace. She arrives at high noon, flanked by 2 massive private security contractors and her legal counsel. Ricardo stands waiting in the vast marble foyer. He is draped in a flawless charcoal suit, but his dark eyes are hollow and entirely starved of hope. The lesson in this moment is legendary. When you finally must face the demon that broke your heart, you stare it dead in the eyes, but you never step onto the battlefield alone. Guard your boundaries and fiercely protect your peace. The tension in that grand foyer is heavy enough to crush bone. Ricardo stands beneath a crystal chandelier, the dark ink of his syndicate tattoos crawling up his throat. The letters proudly spell out family above all. The hypocrisy is so thick it feels like inhaling poison. He whispers her name, and the terrifying king of the underworld sounds like a frightened boy. Alessia does not blink. She delivers her demands with absolute ice, stating she is only here for documents and will vanish in 2 hours. She ruthlessly cuts off his desperate attempt to speak. The lesson here cuts deep into human nature. Words are utterly cheap, and hypocrisy is always laid bare by action. A man can carve his supposed morals right into his flesh, but real loyalty is only measured by his choices in the dark. You and I have probably both felt this exact kind of freezing clarity. Alessia looks him dead in the eye, warning him that any interference will be documented for the judge. Watch the muscles in Ricardo's jaw jump wildly. You can see the violent nature of the mob boss fighting to break out. Yet, for the first time in their tragedy, Alessia feels no instinct to soothe his temper. He admits he sent the staff away so they could be alone, shamelessly weaponizing their unborn baby to trigger her guilt. Without missing a beat, she reminds him that her pregnancy did not stop him from dragging another woman into his bed. The vital lesson here is one of profound liberation. Stop shielding the fragile feelings of the person who destroyed yours. Dropping the urge to heal a toxic partner is where true power begins. Leaving his act in ruins, she turns her back and ascends the marble staircase. Her footsteps halt when panic finally shatters Ricardo's composure. He screams up the stairwell that he loves her. The camera holds on Alessia. She freezes, gripping the cold iron railing. She does not look back. She simply tells the empty air that she no longer believes him, and their definitions of love are fundamentally incompatible. She resumes her climb into the shadows, moving like a ghost through the echoing halls. She gathers only her grandmother's humble jewelry, leaving his blood-soaked diamonds glittering uselessly in the dark. The profound lesson here is undeniable. Love without deep respect is just a disguise for manipulation. If someone's version of romance requires dragging your dignity through the dirt, walk away. She glides past their leather-bound wedding album, viewing it as a glossy artifact of a beautiful lie. With her documents secured, she steps into the shadows of his private study. Slipping the desk lock with a quiet click, a dark skill learned from years beside a Mafia king, she hunts for ledgers to cement her case. What she pulls from the bottom drawer stops her dead. It is not just offshore statements. It is a heavy steel lockbox overflowing with photographs, pictures of Valentina, yes, but also a dozen other unknown faces. It is a staggering visual timeline of betrayal spanning their entire marriage. The lesson to take away is terrifying, but absolutely necessary. Buried secrets always claw their way to the surface. If you ignore the quiet warnings of a liar, life will eventually force your eyes wide open. Picture the scene with me. The camera finds a freezing hardwood floor. In a dark study, there sits Alessia, heavy with a 6-month pregnancy. Trembling fingers hovering over glossy photographs, scattered like tarot cards. The harsh light catches the exact moment her soul shatters. Every image proves Ricardo betrayed her long before she wore white. The soft mercy she carried for him simply evaporates like breath on a winter pane. She descends the grand staircase, finding him pacing the shadows like a crumbling Mafia king. Her voice is terrifyingly dead as she mentions the trophies locked in his desk. The lesson here is undeniable. Betrayal burns the bridge of empathy to ash. You can never expect grace from a spirit you chose to slaughter in the dark. The camera pushes in close, framing the anatomy of a broken vow. Alessia does not just confront her husband. She clinically dismantles him. Her tone is as hollow as a winter wind as she thanks Ricardo for dating his illicit photographs. Watch his body language. The blood completely drains from his face. She stares straight through him, asking if she was ever anything more than a beautiful ornament bought to soften his violent image. When the underworld king falls to his knees upon the marble floor to beg, she raises one steady hand. She tells him to keep his empty apologies, promising to burn his syndicate to ash, using his own souvenirs as the matches. Never forget this reality. When someone hands you the evidence of their own destruction, you use it to finally carve out your new life. Alessia knows exactly where to find the artery. Her eyes are unblinking as she promises to weaponize his own prenuptial agreement against him, turning a legal shield into a jagged blade. She will take full custody, severing him from the only pure thing this Mafia prince has ever loved. She steps deep into his shadow, close enough to see the frantic pulse jumping in his neck. Leaning in, she whispers that he should have honored his sacred vows. As she turns away, his heavy hand shoots out, grasping at empty air. The ruthless architect of the underworld is reduced to a weeping boy, begging for his little girl in a cold hallway. Arrogance is a quiet poison. When you walk through the world believing you are untouchable, you eventually lose the one thing you cannot live without. The lighting shifts, casting bruised shadows over Ricardo. He always believed he pulled the strings of the universe, yet here he stands, a ruined monarch, pleading at the border of his destruction. For one agonizing second, Alessia searches his face. She catches the fading ghost of the magnetic man who swept her away, the echo of the lover who whispered sweet promises. But a ghost is all he is now. Staring into his desperate eyes, she delivers the fatal strike. She calmly tells him he should have thought of his family before making a secret romance his true religion. The heavy oak door slams shut between them, echoing like a gunshot in the grand foyer. You simply cannot construct a lasting fortress on the crumbling foundation of a lie. She firmly refuses to be a casualty in his impending war. You and I have seen how these power struggles play out. The legal battlefield becomes a theater of exhausting tactics. Ricardo commands his expensive attorneys to suffocate her with paperwork, trying to bury his betrayal. It is unrelenting psychological warfare. But watch Alessia. She plants her feet like an ancient fortress, building a quiet sanctuary far from the toxic gravity of his estate. Channeling her strength into her unborn child, she faces every appointment like a lone warrior. Eventually, she steps into a therapist's office. For a proud woman, the heavy click of that door feels like an admission of defeat. Yet the exact opposite is true. Seeking a guiding hand in your darkest hour is actually the ultimate demonstration of true human resilience. The camera lingers on her trembling hands. Alessia believes sitting on this therapy couch, is a monument to her brokenness. But this quiet room offers a profound refuge. There are no pitying stares, only a grounded presence as she unpacks 3 years of Mafia illusions and the cold isolation of solo motherhood. Alessia is drowning in tears, berating her own foolishness for not seeing the monster hiding behind his tailored suits. The therapist gently halts the spiral, explaining that offering trust to a partner is not a tragic character flaw. It is the purest definition of being human. The real triumph was walking away the moment his mask slipped. You are never foolish for having an open heart. You claim your absolute power when you firmly revoke that trust from those who only play games. Let us look at this piece by piece. This is where her emotional architecture finally shifts. Alessia admits how Ricardo manipulated her, painting her as the single ray of light in his brutal world. She craved the illusion that their romance was insulated from his violence. The therapist assures her that hungering for pure love is never a weakness. The guilt rests entirely on the predator who weaponized her empathy. That validation breaks the dam, and years of tension flow out in heavy tears. Months later, heavily pregnant, she steps back into the light. She attends an elite gallery opening, boldly returning to the exact room where she first met the devil himself. True healing means standing at the scene of the crash and realizing you actually survived. Watch the framing of this moment. Crossing the threshold of that elegant gallery is a calculated act of war. She is silently broadcasting to the elite that she refuses to be erased or reduced to a tragic whisper. She glides through the softly lit space in an emerald gown that honors the heavy curve of her pregnancy. Radiating an untouchable calm, she knows perfectly well the wolf is waiting. Across the room, Ricardo holds court among his dangerous associates. His immaculate suit frames the dark, violent ink climbing his neck. Those same tattoos once sent an intoxicating thrill through her veins. Now, they are glaring warning signs flashing in the dark. Remember this crucial lesson. Red flags are harsh warnings meant to protect your spirit, not pretty decorations to romanticize a broken heart. Time slows down, their eyes lock across the crowded floor, and the atmosphere instantly turns to heavy lead. Alessia refuses to blink. Ricardo stands frozen like a marble statue of dread. For a few agonizing heartbeats, the expensive artwork and murmuring aristocrats melt away. The universe shrinks to a suffocating standoff. Then Alessia drops the hammer without lifting a finger. She simply smiles. It is not an invitation. It is the chilling smile of a woman who has already won the war. She turns her attention to Marco, a powerful older gentleman, laughing warmly at his stories. She feels Ricardo's furious gaze scorching her spine. Let him burn, she decides in the silence of her mind. She spends the rest of the night floating freely, a queen reclaiming her peaceful throne. Naturally, the wealthy elite are feasting on the tension. Whispers hum through the gallery like an agitated hive as people trade dark rumors about Ricardo. Quietly applauding Alessia for her courtroom victories, she allows the gossip to wash over her with impenetrable grace. Then, Marco gently places a weathered old hand on the small of her back to guide her toward the champagne jar. It is a deeply innocent gesture, but to a possessive mafia prince lurking in the shadows, it is an unforgivable declaration of war. The room's temperature plummets. Alessia feels the cold prickle of danger crawl up her spine seconds before she even turns her head. Ricardo is advancing. Always trust that sudden drop in your stomach. Your intuition recognizes a predator long before your eyes ever do. You and I know that terrifying shift in the air right before a storm breaks. Alessia has 30 seconds before her toxic former husband shatters his public mask. She smoothly excuses herself from Marco, slipping away before Ricardo can close the gap. She weaves into a tight circle of wealthy socialites near the exit. Finding safety in numbers is a brilliant survival tactic when managing a volatile monster. Ricardo freezes dead in his tracks. Even from 20 feet away, his raw fury is suffocating. His jaw locks, tattooed hands curling into white-knuckled fists as he wrestles with the urge to drag her out into the night. Alessia simply casts one casual glance over her shoulder, meeting his manic stare. The unsaid words hang heavy in the gallery silence. I do not belong to you anymore. Let us look closely at the crushing weight of a single, dismissing glance. For a man used to absolute control, her indifference struck like a physical blow. His dark eyes swept the room, brewing a storm of fury, heartbreak, and toxic obsession. It was a stare that would freeze an ordinary person. Yet Alessia simply turned her back, exiting the gathering early under the polite guise of her pregnancy. She felt her spirit soar. She had stared into the hungry jaws of the wolf and refused to blink, proving to him and the watching elite that Gidi and she remained completely unbroken. Slipping into her car, she closed her eyes and breathed out a sigh of hard-earned victory. The lesson here is profound. The purest revenge is proving that a toxic person has absolutely no power over your internal peace. Let us step into this space together. The quiet of the sedan shatters when a low voice slips from the pitch-black rear seats. Alessia freezes, her chest heaving as Ricardo leans forward, his brutal face carving itself out of the shadows. He whispers that the driver gripping the wheel is already his, and that every locked gate in this city kneels to his reputation. He wants her to feel the suffocating weight of his total control. But watch closely as Alessia forces her trembling jaw to lock, commanding him to leave. He snarls, spitting poison about how his blood-soaked empire pays for her pristine world. Yet the tragedy remains absolute. All the money on earth cannot purchase genuine freedom, and true sanctuary is only ever found in the iron boundaries we boldly defend. Her voice is cold as she reminds him that her trust is shielded by the very firm washing his syndicate money. They are untouchable. Watch the exact frame where Ricardo breaks. The terrifying predator dissolves into hollow desperation. He begs, his hands trembling, offering the world just to wake up near his little girl. The terror of losing his daughter strips him to the bone. But Alessia does not flinch. She tells him he destroyed their family the night he chose betrayal. He cries that it was one mistake, but she fires back with the hidden photographs, exposing a long pattern of calculated lies. He planted the bitter seeds of his own ruin. The harsh truth spares no one. Your darkest secrets always leave a trail, and the people you hurt will inevitably read every single page. Picture the oppressive midnight air, rain bleeding down the tinted glass. Alessia unleashes her fury, her voice trembling yet sharper than broken glass. She hurls the damning photographs across the leather seats, scattering them like paper ghosts, proof of the monster he hides behind his suits. Ricardo desperately claims a right to their unborn child, but she cuts him down. Blood does not forge a father. Honoring your sacred promises makes a true father, and he burned that bridge to ash. Suddenly, the tension shatters. With a terrifying blur, he closes the gap between them, a violent shadow lunging into the dim light. The lesson here hangs heavy in the dark. Biology might plant the seed of a family, but only unwavering loyalty and daily choices can actually keep it alive. The camera lingers on this frozen frame. Alessia holds her ground, staring into the ruined eyes of Ricardo. She asks, voice steady. If he truly wants to add assault to his bloody ledger of sins. For one breathless second, the ruthless boss awakens, a terrifying storm funneling toward her. But then his armor shatters. His heavy hands drop. For the first time, the untouchable Don is paralyzed by the terror of losing his legacy. His voice fractures, confessing he has no idea how to repair this wreckage. Alessia remains a marble statue, reminding him that the universe always collects its debts. Defeated, he orders her out into the cold rain. We are left with a brutal truth. Even the most powerful titans must eventually pay the ultimate price for the shadows they sow. The camera focuses on the chill of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Althasha yanks her wrist free from his grip. She looks this underworld king dead in the eye and constructs an iron fortress right on the sidewalk. No messages, no midnight calls, only the sterile language of attorneys. She commands him to stop haunting her life from the shadows of his tinted cars. Ricardo, the most lethal predator in the city, simply swallows it. He steps backward into the biting wind, a man hollowed out by his own choices. As his sedan bleeds into the dark, the silence left behind is deafening. It reminds us of a vital reality. Enforcing a boundary against someone you loved is agonizing, but protecting your own soul requires you to stand tall and never surrender a single inch. You and I must look closely at the tragic poetry of this final shot. What truly broke her was not his rage, but his agonizing desperation. Ricardo was a titan who solved every obstacle with brutal force, yet standing here, his voice shattered. She once worshipped him as a dark god, but now he stands as utterly helpless in the rain. The devastating part? A quiet corner of her soul desperately wanted to hold this ticking time bomb and soothe his panic, but she forces herself to stay grounded. A gentle kick against her palm reminds her of the fragile life blooming inside. We must confront a painful truth about human nature. You cannot heal a deeply broken soul, no matter the vast depth of your love. You must secure your own survival before you are dragged entirely into the dark. The camera pans slowly across the dim, cavernous room, settling on Alessia. The cold moonlight catches the sharp, unyielding line of her jaw. This is the exact frame where she takes her life back. She isn't leaving out of spite, nor some hollow thirst for revenge. Her hand rests gently against her swelling stomach. She fights for the unborn daughter, breathing softly beneath her ribs. Through the blinding haze of a brutal battlefield divorce, she barricades herself behind armed men, immune to her husband's toxic influence. The shadows here whisper a quiet truth. True power isn't about throwing the hardest punch or matching a monster's cruelty. Real strength is having the courage to break a poison generational curse entirely, ensuring that the people you love will finally know what it means to breathe without looking over their shoulder. Let's pull focus on the mahogany desk. Her lawyers slide a stack of bank records across the polished wood, the dry scrape echoing like a gunshot. The mercenaries guarding her are draining her family's inheritance, but the price of clean air is worth every penny. Finally, the attorneys unearth the rotting, blood-soaked roots of Ricardo's empire: smuggling, extortion, the sudden disappearance of a rival boss just days before she wore white. Her lawyer avoids her eyes as he delivers the final blow. The man she shared a bed with is a living nightmare. In the bruised corners of her chest, she already knew. You and I have probably both played that game. But closing your eyes to a blaring warning sign doesn't make it vanish. It only guarantees you will be walking completely blind when the ugly truth shatters your carefully built illusion. The camera cuts to a close-up of Alessia's trembling hands. She is plagued by night terrors, waking up in cold sweats as she remembers the dead, hollow stare Ricardo wore when dealing with enemies. The agonizing question chokes her. Did the exact same hands that gently cradled her face also squeeze the life out of begging men? The horrifying answer is yes. She had twisted her mind into tight knots, desperately loving a phantom built on bodies. But the naive, smiling girl from the altar is gone. In her place stands a pale woman carrying the crushing weight of clarity. Then, a ghost reaches through the silence. A sealed envelope lands on her lawyer's desk, marked by the deliberate handwriting of the syndicate king himself. It leaves us with a simple rule. You can bury the truth under 10 feet of dirt, but it will always claw its way back to the surface. The lighting shifts to a harsh yellow as the envelope is torn open. Ricardo's letter reads like an echo bouncing out of a deep abyss. He doesn't start with a plea for forgiveness. Instead, he coldly admits that his apologies are nothing but useless ash. He married her for one utterly selfish reason. She made his hollow, dead chest feel human. Think about it. He was a boy raised in a desolate underworld, taught from his first breath that a smile is just a hidden blade waiting to strike. To a man conditioned like that, falling in love is nothing but signing an invitation to your own funeral. It teaches us an unsettling lesson about survival. A toxic world will completely rewrite your soul. Even the most ruthless crime bosses pulling the city's strings are often just broken, terrified little boys hiding behind a heavy mask of absolute power. The black ink on the heavy stationery betrays the fragile, weeping core of a monster. He writes that when she looked at him, she never saw the syndicate shadow trailing behind his feet. She saw the man beneath the blood. She managed to find the single, dying ember of decency he had buried under a lifetime of violent ambition. He bleeds his absolute failure onto the paper, confessing he still loves her for that grace. But pure love is rarely enough to silence a starving demon. His fatal flaw was genuinely believing he could lock his brutal reality in a box while bathing in the soft warmth of their home. He fought the cycle, and the cycle won. The smeared ink leaves us with a harsh truth. You can never build your walls high enough to separate your darkness from your light. The shadows you try to hide will always bleed through and swallow the things you hold most dear. The scene fades to a quiet, suffocating gray. He signs off not with a desperate plea, but with a crushing, absolute surrender. He needs her to understand that his betrayal had nothing to do with her worth. It was simply the inevitable collapse of his own fractured soul. He pens the hardest words a proud, dangerous man can bear, admitting she deserves a life completely untouched by his chaos. Alessia reads the heavy script 3 times, her face a sculpted mask of cold stone. She slides the letter into a drawer and steps out into the sunlight as if her ribs are not quietly caving in. But fate has a sick sense of humor. 3 weeks early, the sudden, sharp rush of water hitting the living room floor shatters the quiet morning. The takeaway is undeniable. No matter how meticulously you try to plan your escape, life will always kick the door down and force your hand. The camera pans across a claustrophobic hospital room bathed in merciless blinding light. Alessia grips the stark white sheets, her agonizing cries swallowed by the chaotic blur of rushing nurses. Her mother and best friend stand like stone pillars, forming a desperate shield against the longest 12 hours of her existence. But in the hollow, ringing silence between the crushing waves of pain, her exhausted mind betrays her. She doesn't picture the ruthless crime boss who rules the city's shadows. She only sees the ghost of the man who promised to hold her hand. Beneath the heavy armor of her rage, A quiet, suffocating grief shatters her. It leaves us with a devastating realization. The sinister choices we make in the shadows will always, eventually, strip away the brightest, most sacred moments of our lives. Rain violently lashes against the frosted hospital window, mirroring the shattered life she thought they were building. But at exactly 3:47 in the morning, the fragile, trembling cry of baby Juliana slices cleanly through the heavy sorrow. 6 pounds, 8 ounces, a crown of midnight hair, the devastatingly sharp features of the phantom she left behind. The second Alessia pulls that warm, delicate newborn to her exhausted chest. The entire axis of her universe violently shifts. Juliana blinks up with those haunting, pitch-black eyes, and Alessia's heart shatters and stitches itself back together in a single, agonizing beat. The hitmen, the bitter divorce, the lingering dread, it all dissolves into static. The lesson is beautifully simple. Sometimes the arrival of a completely unwritten chapter is the only thing that teaches us what truly matters. Bathed in the soft grey light of dawn, she stares down at her newborn daughter, quietly whispering an unbreakable oath to be her shield. Tears fall so fiercely, carving hot trails down her exhausted face. She doesn't even realize she is weeping until her mother gently touches her cheek. But out there, beyond this fragile sanctuary, the city's dark underbelly is already shifting. Ricardo knows. He is a phantom who owns the concrete labyrinth, a boss with ears in every shadow. The very next morning, he does not burst through the doors as a tyrant. He simply materializes in the sterile hallway, framed by flickering fluorescent lights. His immaculate dark suit contrasts sharply with eyes hollowed out by sleepless torment. It reminds us of a bitter truth. Power can buy the entire world, but it can never buy back the precious moments you burned to the ground. You and I have probably felt that sudden, freezing drop in the air when a ghost walks into the room. His sprawling black tattoos stand out violently against a pale, exhausted neck. He looks less like a king and more like a man who barely survived a fatal collision. The grandmother spots him first, voice trembling as she reaches for the call button. But Alessia refuses to flinch. She stares right through the heavy glass, locking onto his hollow gaze. The instant he sees the tiny bundle wrapped in her arms, the imposing, broad-shouldered Titan literally sags, leaning desperately toward a child he hasn't even touched. Against every survival instinct, Alessia tells her mother to open the door. Just 5 minutes. It teaches us something profound. Offering grace to the person who broke you isn't about saving them. It is entirely about setting your own soul free. Let's step inside that suffocating hospital room together. Ricardo crosses the threshold exactly like a man walking barefoot across broken glass. Every single muscle twitches with agonizing hesitation, terrified that breathing too hard might shatter this fragile illusion. When he finally speaks, the sound is pure gravel and rust, scraping out a desperate, whispered, "Thank you," but Alessia gives him only winter. Her posture turns to stone, making it brutally clear. This is a visitation, not a pardon. He takes 3 agonizing steps toward the bed. The damage is laid bare. Deep, bruised shadows hollow out his dark eyes. The same violent hands that dismantle empires are trembling as he begs to hold his daughter. Never forget this reality. Real power is never found in street corners or bank accounts. True power is holding the one fragile thing you are terrified to lose. Every screaming survival instinct in her exhausted veins begs her to pull the baby back. The man looming over her bed is a walking, breathing hurricane. Yet, the heavy camera lingers on her torn expression, acknowledging a bitter truth. A child deserves a father, no matter what dark sins he carries. With painful reluctance, her trembling arms extend, passing baby Juliana to him. The cinematic contrast is simply breathtaking. This hardened architect of street violence cradles the tiny infant as if she were spun from glass and thin air. His famously merciless eyes flood with immediate, devastating warmth. He breathes her name, a fractured whisper honoring his late grandmother. Alessia quietly nods. Listen closely to this. Sometimes, the absolute most fragile things in this entire world are the exact instruments required to break the hardest, coldest of men. The cramped hospital room transforms into an eerie suspended sanctuary. Ricardo murmurs, his voice cracking, that their newborn is absolutely perfect. Alessia cuts back instantly, her tone like broken glass, noting the girl has his eyes, and praying heaven helps her survive that dark legacy. The silence stretches, suffocating and heavy, broken only by the cold, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It's a tragic portrait of a ruined dynasty. Then Ricardo drops the match. His tone goes terrifyingly dead as he promises to sign everything. The divorce papers, full, uncontested custody. He will build an iron wall to protect them from the monster he is. When a shocked Alessia asks why, his defeated gaze meets hers. It reveals a profound lesson. Sometimes, genuine love means locking yourself in a dark, inescapable cage just so the people you cherish can finally fly. Look closely into the shadowed, pitch-black eyes of the city's undisputed king, and you will find absolutely nothing but a burned-out wasteland. This feared syndicate leader has been violently reduced to ash by a sleeping infant and a woman who simply refuses to shatter. His deep, resonant voice splinters as he confesses that she was right all along. He traded his actual flesh and blood for a freezing, empty throne. The agony radiates off his skin as he admits his little girl will grow up knowing her father is a monster, and she will be entirely right. With quiet, crushing reverence, he presses a lingering kiss against the baby's warm forehead, surrendering his entire world. He hands her back, swearing, the war is finally over. We must remember this. The hardest lessons in life always seem to arrive at the exact moment it is permanently too late to rewrite the ending. Stick with me here, because this is the exact frame where the terrifying facade permanently crumbles. He practically begs for scraps, pleading for the right to just look at his child, even if Alessia stands there like a warden holding a rifle. The grand illusion of the untouchable boss turns to dust. Riccardo Moretti, the violent ghost haunting Milan, buries his face in his scarred hands, his broad shoulders violently shaking as he chokes back the sobs of a wounded animal. Watching the total collapse of this dangerous giant, a microscopic crack forms in Alessia's ice. It isn't forgiveness. You cannot easily rebuild a burned-down house. Still, she quietly murmurs that she will think about it. True survival often means having the quiet courage to walk away from the raging fire, even if it leaves you facing the exhausting, lonely trenches of new motherhood completely alone. A fiercely loyal circle of friends forms a protective fortress around the quiet house, bringing warm meals and rocking the restless baby so Alessia can just stand under a scalding shower and feel human again. In the grim background, the legal machinery grinds forward with terrifying speed. True to his desperate word, Ricardo offers zero resistance. He quietly signs away his parental rights, surrendering the kingdom of her childhood. He wires a staggering, quiet mountain of wealth, ensuring his daughter never knows the bitter taste of struggle. His only reward is two brief, strictly supervised hours a month. When the ink dries on a freezing October morning, the violent storm of their marriage officially dies. The lesson here is incredibly heavy. Sometimes the absolute greatest act of unconditional love is removing yourself entirely from the story so the innocent can thrive. Staring down at the cold, finalized legal documents, Alessia feels no sweet rush of victory or grand exhale of relief. She just feels entirely hollowed out. Time, however, is a relentless river, dragging her forward into the light. As little Juliana reaches 3 months old, she transforms into a quiet, profound blessing. Her bright, easy smiles serve as a daily anchor for a mother slowly healing from catastrophic betrayal. Yet the universe always has a darkly cruel sense of irony. The beautiful infant is steadily becoming a perfect mirror image of the underworld king who destroyed their family. She possesses those exact piercing eyes and that fiercely stubborn chin. We must always remember this. We cannot control the lingering ghosts of our past, but we can always choose to fiercely love the beautiful future standing right in front of us, no matter whose face it wears. When the scheduled visitation hour strikes, Ricardo operates with the terrifying, cold precision of a ticking clock. He knocks on the door at the exact minute and vanishes into the shadows the second his time expires. There is no subtle manipulation, no lingering, dangerous charm directed at his former wife. Instead, he simply sheds the thick, blood-stained skin of an underworld predator at the doormat. To witness a man who commands violent shadows suddenly folding pastel baby blankets with the gentle, shaking hands of a saint is a jarring psychological trip. His heavy, gravelly voice, usually meant for issuing death sentences, fills the sunny hallway with soft old Italian lullabies. Alessia watches from the doorway, entirely silent. We have to remember this. We all contain violent contradictions, and sometimes the most dangerous people harbor an unexpected, tragic tenderness. The camera lingers on Alessia, perfectly still in the dim living room. The man on her velvet couch, bathed in amber light, looks nothing like the ruthless predator who burned their marriage. He left his criminal crown at the door, sitting there like a polite ghost. You and I know that haunting well, the tension of a quiet room. This fragile illusion holds for months, until the night suddenly shatters. Her rare glass of wine sits untouched as the iron gate buzzer shrieks. Through the grainy security monitor, a messenger trembles in the shadows, clutching a sealed envelope. Life teaches us this cruel rhythm over and over. Right when you finally exhale and believe your sanctuary is safe, your darkest history simply finds a new door to kick down. The breathless runner whispers that the envelope holds critical intelligence on Ricardo. Watch Alessia. Adrenaline spiking her pulse as she rips the paper. Inside rests a glossy photograph of Valentina, the exact phantom who poisoned their vows. The true horror lies in the background. Ricardo stands right behind her in a sterile hallway, his tattooed hand resting on her arm. The timestamp mocks her, dated just 3 days ago. White-hot fury blurs her vision. She dials her attorney, hand shaking, ready to burn the city down. Yet the calm voice on the line commands her to breathe. The lesson we must carry is absolute. When blinding anger screams at you to strike immediately, sheer patience is the only armor that stops you from walking into a fatal snare. The attorney paints an unforgiving picture. A kingpin like Moretti collects enemies who would gladly detonate his family just to watch the man bleed. This photo might be a smoking gun, or a clever forgery crafted to ignite a war. We need cold proof first. Most expect a betrayed woman to ignite with vengeance, but Alessia is collapsing inward, ground to dust by the emotional whiplash. Instead of pouring gasoline on the sparks, she transforms into a silent predator. When he returns, she studies the rise and fall of his chest, hunting for the tells she memorized over a decade of marriage. Life constantly reminds us of this simple truth. Complete silence and sharp observation will always expose far more secrets than the most violent confrontation. The air in the house sits uncomfortably heavy. The dim lighting casts Ricardo in soft shadow. He is mesmerized by the infant, radiating a devotion he never offered Alessia before their world burned. A cruel voice echoes in her mind. He used to look at her with that exact worship. Right before driving the blade into her back, she lets this poison sit for a week. At last, with the nursery silent, she steps out of the dark and traps him in the corridor. He freezes, completely off balance. Her hand does not shake as she slams the photograph against his chest. A genuine flash of terror ripples across his stoic mask. Stick with me here, because this illustrates a devastating rule. The darkest sins we bury always resurrect themselves right at the exact moment we finally dare to lower our defenses. Watch his eyes narrow. Confusion registers first until the image clicks. Instantly, the tender father vanishes and the chilling aura of the syndicate boss floods the hallway. His voice drops to a terrifying murmur, demanding the sender's name. Alessia mirrors his ice. "No name," she replies, throwing the venom straight back at him. The ensuing silence is suffocating. Finally, the tension snaps. He drags a shaking hand through his hair, the monster receding. "The photo is real," he whispers, "but the story is a deception." Valentina is dying of aggressive cancer. Penniless and broken, she begged him for a final chance at life. We must remember this quiet lesson. The most profound, heartbreaking human truths often lie buried deeply beneath our most catastrophic and fearful assumptions. Alessia is pinned in place, staggering under his confession. A bitter laugh escapes her. Does he really expect her to swallow this tragedy? He stares directly into her soul and forbids her from believing him. He tells her to track the hospital payments herself, admitting he incinerated her faith and deserves no grace. Then her voice cracks on the heaviest question. Why pour a fortune into saving the exact woman who burned their world to ash? His gaze drops. "Because she is dying," he whispers, "and regardless of their wretched sins, no human being deserves to face death alone." He is fighting a quiet war to clean his broken soul. The life lesson rings with pure clarity. Genuine redemption is forged in the silent dark, far away from any audience, when absolutely nobody is clapping for you. The frame holds on Alessia's searching eyes. She scours the rigid lines of his face, hunting for a lie. To her bewilderment, the canvas is clean. She hardens her jaw, warning him that she will fact-check every syllable. If she finds one false note, his daughter is gone forever. Ricardo merely nods, stepping back into the shadows, welcoming the scrutiny. The twist cuts like a knife. The oncology ward verifies everything. Valentina is decaying from stage 3 cancer, sustained only by a phantom benefactor covering the massive bills. Let us pause and examine this together. The vital life lesson we must learn is to always trust, but aggressively verify. The bleeding truth is often infinitely more bizarre and complex than the neat lies we construct to keep ourselves safe. A blood-soaked kingpin draining his coffers to keep his treacherous mistress breathing is a cinematic paradox. Alessia's mind fractures trying to map his psychology. Is this another labyrinth of manipulation? Or is the devil trying to plant a single white rose in a lifetime of scorched earth? When he returns for the baby, she stops looking for the trapdoor. The camera simply observes him. This terrifying architect of violence cradles his tiny daughter as if a harsh breath might shatter her. He hums a melancholic lullaby, a frequency of love his brutal soldiers could never comprehend. This paints a profound life lesson for us. The human soul defies logic. Quite often, the most calloused monsters harbor a desperate, bleeding softness that defies every single expectation we project onto them. The infant cries, piercing the quiet. Instantly, the kingpin paces the hardwood, rocking Juliana with a desperate gentleness until she settles into a peaceful rhythm. The camera tells no lies. His adoration is agonizingly pure. Watching his shoulders sway in the dim light, a tragic question anchors in Alessia's chest. Can a man be venom to his wife, yet a flawless sanctuary for his child? Time drips forward to December. The baby's first Christmas unfolds in golden light, surrounded by safe, loyal faces. Ricardo is exiled, locked out of the holiday to shield the innocent from his violent storm. Carry this brutal life lesson forward. You are entirely permitted to build iron gates to protect your sacred peace, even if it leaves someone you once worshipped freezing in the dark. A package materializes on the porch. No return address, just her name carved in the sharp ink she would recognize in her sleep. She peels back the wrapping to expose a fragile first edition of her favorite Italian poetry. The tragedy hits like a physical blow. She whispered a fantasy about this exact volume half a decade ago. Caught between the pages lies a heavy note. He writes that he memorized every dream she gave him, but failed at proving they mattered. Alessia is frozen, fingers trembling over the cracked leather. The romance is dead, but her chest caves in for the ghost of the boy she married. Grasp this painful life lesson tightly. True attention to another's soul is a devastating force, and a quiet whisper you gave away years ago can drop with the absolute heaviest weight today. The blinding hatred has burned out. What remains is a desolate wasteland where a heart simply forgets its rhythm. As winter bleeds into a new year, an eerie truce takes root. Alessia stops treating his visits like an interrogation. In that quiet space, Ricardo begins bleeding out his sins. He confesses he is dismantling the syndicate. He is abandoning his violent throne to carve out something clean, terrified his daughter will choke on the ash of his legacy. When Alessia quietly asks why he is handing her the keys to his ruin, he stares at the floorboards. He just wants her to stop seeing a monster. Take this profound life lesson with you. Resurrecting dead trust demands a grueling, unwavering crawl through the dark, long after the final destructive blow has been struck. He whispers he refuses to bury his hope, but the sanctuary shatters the next day. The camera focuses on Alessia, cradling the infant as the phone screams. She answers, and the temperature drops. A metallic voice calls her Mrs. Moretti. The phantom orders her to pass a blood-soaked greeting to Ricardo from Victor Anton. A threat against the baby's life hangs like a guillotine before the line goes dead. Pure dread paralyzes her spine. She does not call the police. She calls Ricardo. Because when the wolves of the underworld surround your home, you need a greater monster to hold the gates. The life lesson here is absolute. When the floodwaters rise, you must swallow your pride and summon the only devil strong enough to fight the tide, no matter how much they broke your heart. The phone barely finishes its first ring before he answers. Panic strangles Alessia's throat as she breathes the cursed name into the receiver. Victor Anton. A suffocating silence swallows the line. When Ricardo speaks, every trace of warmth is gone, replaced by the freezing tone of a killer. Lock the doors, he commands. 12 minutes later, the shriek of burning rubber tears the street apart. He does not arrive as a mere father. He brings the crushing weight of a criminal empire, heavy sedans blocking the road, while armed enforcers flood the shadows. He shatters her doorway, like a dark storm, ready to drown the city in blood for his child. It teaches us a heavy truth. Real devotion is measured only in the brutal seconds of collapse, showing up the moment the dark falls. His dark eyes lock onto Alessia, and the tiny child clutched to her chest, scanning them with desperate urgency. The moment he knows they are breathing, the frantic father dies, replaced by the freezing gaze of a syndicate king. He demands to hear every syllable of the call. As Alessia whispers the violent threat, the muscles in his jaw turn to granite. He lays bare the grim reality. Victor Anton is a merciless Russian rival who has crossed the unforgivable boundary by hunting a child. Stepping close, his voice drops into a gravelly command. They will vanish tonight into his mountain fortress, far from the bleeding streets. We must remember this vital lesson. The violent sins of our history cast dangerously long shadows, and buried debts always rise to haunt the innocent if ignored. Alessia rejects the order without a flinch. Her voice cuts the room, reminding him she signed those custody papers to shield their daughter from this exact underworld nightmare. Ricardo physically recoils, a proud king shattering under the sharp truth. He quietly confesses his failure, admitting he underestimated his rivals. He practically begs her to let him control their survival. A bitter laugh escapes her throat, because absolute control was always the poison that killed their marriage. Yet looking closer, she sees the cracks. Beneath the icy exterior lies a terrified father, pleading for his little girl's life from a woman who deeply despises him. The lesson is undeniable. Pride is a deadly venom in a crisis, and surviving the storm always requires swallowing your ego. Tonight, you and I are walking down a tragic road together. Picture Ricardo, a ruthless man who breaks spirits to get his way, now spiritually on his knees, begging to protect his blood. The suffocating silence is pierced by baby Juliana letting out a terrified cry. Alessia pulls the trembling infant to her chest, her heart hammering, and makes a rapid choice. 24 hours. That is all he gets. Ricardo releases an exhale thick, with years of regret sweeping them away to a shadow-draped villa high in the hills of Milan. It is a massive fortress of steel and stone, guarding a pure, untouched nursery. Here is a little wisdom for you to hold on to. Always have a sanctuary built in your life, because you simply never know when the ground beneath you will entirely collapse. Once inside those massive walls, he leaves them alone in the ringing quiet. Alessia paces the dark hardwood, her eyes catching the freezing glow of the security feeds. On the monitors, Ricardo is entirely transformed into the merciless general of his syndicate, directing his soldiers without a second of sleep. At 3 a.m, the house feels like a tomb. She wanders downstairs, finding him bathed in the dim kitchen light. His jacket is tossed aside, sleeves rolled up to expose the dark ink of his brutal history. His exhausted, hollow eyes stare at a glass of whiskey he refuses to touch. His voice is a broken whisper, asking only if their daughter is sleeping. Here is the undeniable truth. Pure dedication only reveals itself in these agonizing, lonely hours when absolutely no one is watching. She steps into the pale light, asking what his next move will be. His response is a terrifying rumble. His men are hunting the Russian boss. He stops short of describing the blood, remembering how deeply she despises his dark world. Yet the adrenaline still hums in Alessia's veins. Bone-tired, she pulls up a heavy chair and sits directly beside him. Ricardo freezes, his dark eyes locked on her in pure disbelief. He cannot fathom that she willingly closed the distance. She mutters a cold warning not to overthink it, and he offers a slow nod. They exist together in the thick quiet of the morning, Finding an eerie sanctuary in the shared silence, it exposes a very difficult truth in life. Sometimes, the very architect of your destruction is the only soul who truly understands the violent storm you are trying to survive. The silence breaks when he asks why she chose him over the authorities. Alessia offers no comfort. She tells him flatly that the police are mere paper shields against a predator like Anton. Staring at the man who ruined her life, she delivers a brutal truth. He was an abysmal husband, but an absolute master of violence. When her daughter's life is on the line, he is the only blade sharp enough to sever the threat. Then comes the devastating strike. She quietly reveals she no longer hates him. Hate requires a burning fire she refuses to feed. She is left with nothing but heavy exhaustion and icy disappointment. The tragedy echoes loudly here. Apathy is the absolute final stage of grief. When a person entirely loses the fire required to even fight you, you know the bond is truly dead in the ground. Ricardo throws back the whiskey, letting the burn mirror the devastating truth he is ready to unleash. Ree's voice scrapes the dim kitchen walls as he swears their love was never a lie. She was the single light that made a monster crave goodness. Alessia meets his gaze with hollow eyes, asking the only question left in the ashes. Then, why didn't you choose to be better? The air in the room dies. He drops his head, whispering that true goodness is a crushing weight he could not carry. Beneath the gold and the guns, he confesses he is nothing but a coward. Looking at the apex predator of the underworld, Alessia sees only a deeply shattered man. We must face this terrifying reality eventually. Stripping away your pride to confess your darkest flaws is pure agony, but it remains the only real bridge toward genuine redemption. 3 breathless days bleed away before the threat is erased from the earth. Alessia refuses to ask how Ricardo and his syndicate disposed of Anton. Willful ignorance is the only armor you get when dancing with the devil. On the 4th morning, Ricardo appears in her doorway, carrying the weight of a century without sleep. His voice is jagged gravel as he delivers the verdict. They are safe. Now, stick with me, because this is where their tragic dynamic gets fascinating. The silence swells, heavy with the terrifying unknown of tomorrow. She studies her ex-husband, staring at a haunting paradox. He is a genuine monster who moonlights as her guardian angel. It forces us to swallow a bitter truth about life. Sometimes the exact hands that viciously broke your heart are the only ones capable of shielding it from the fire. In the morning light, Alessia draws a hard line. She demands their daughter know a living, breathing father, not a supervised ghost haunting the weekends. Ricardo visibly recoils, as if catching a bullet to the chest. Her voice softens into something painfully human. She admits that a man willing to stand guard for 3 sleepless days to shield his has earned more than a few miserable hours a month. In a flash of raw clarity, she confesses that her obsession with punishing his dark past was suffocating their baby's future. It is not total absolution, but a monumental shift. She finally sees his effort to change. There is a profound piece of wisdom hidden in this choice. Clutching onto righteous anger will only ever poison your own tomorrow. Releasing those heavy grudges is the only real way to finally breathe clean air again. Ricardo stares at her, his impenetrable armor completely shattered. He looks like a condemned man handed a pardon on the gallows. Swallowing hard, he asks what she needs. Her answer is a demand for bulletproof honesty. No more living in the dark. No more buried threats. If he ever lies again, she and the baby will evaporate like smoke. He gives a slow, solemn nod, surrendering to every term. For the first time in years, she looks past the Mafia crown and genuinely believes the man wearing it. Utterly drained by the emotional whiplash, they lock themselves away in the quiet safe house for another week, choosing isolation over the chaotic outside world. It perfectly illustrates how destruction paves the road for actual growth. Sometimes hitting the absolute rock bottom provides the only solid concrete you need to build a new life from the broken rubble. The brutal edges of their lives do not magically dissolve into some cheap romance. Instead, they carefully carve out a fragile ceasefire in the middle of life war. We witness them sharing silent meals, trading the sleeping baby back and forth in the deep blue hours of the night. The city's most lethal apex predator is now quietly sitting in therapist offices and studying dog-eared parenting books. When Alessia finally asks what triggered this monumental shift, his answer is agonizingly brief. He stares into her eyes and admits it was the absolute terror of losing her forever. It is a quiet, tragic confession that uncovers a massive truth about the human soul. True, permanent change never blooms in times of comfort. It only ignites the second you realize you are holding the only thing that matters, and you are about to let it slip away. The camera lingers on his face, stripping away the hardened armor of a syndic boss. His voice, usually a weapon of command, fractures into something quiet. He swears to her, under the dim amber light, that no other woman has touched his bed since the day she vanished. Valentina was nothing but a phantom from a dead past. Instantly, Alessia recoils, pulling her invisible armor tight. But instead of igniting into his legendary rage, Ricardo stays rooted, calm. He begs for nothing but time, asking only that she watch his daily choices and decide if he is worth saving. The tragedy shifts. We all learn this painful truth eventually. The most beautifully spoken promises are just ash in the wind. Only the quiet, grueling consistency of our daily actions can rebuild a ruined temple. Frame by frame, we watch Alessia stitch her shattered soul back together. The shadow of the Mafia wife is fading, replaced by a woman fiercely claiming her own survival. The sprawling estate is gone, traded for a sunlit room where a new reality takes root. Their dynamic has twisted into a breathtaking paradox. The ruthless boss now sits on a woven rug, bathed in afternoon light, spending agonizing hours just stacking blocks with their little girl. He has traded the throne of terror for the exhausting, invisible labor of a father trying to earn his breath. It is a visual study in penance. We always beg for a miracle cure, but true healing is never a sudden lightning strike. It is the slow, grueling march of patience, proving that the deepest wounds only close when given the grace of unhurried time. Let us look at this tragic masterpiece together, piece by shattered piece. Alessia locks her eyes onto his, refusing to soften the devastating space between them. She lays out the brutal mathematics of betrayal. Healing is not a sudden embrace, but a bloody, years-long excavation of every lie he ever told. She forces him to look directly at the wreckage. But Ricardo drops his shield, standing in the smoking crater of his own making. He vows he will never seek the easy comfort of another woman's bed. He chooses the ruin. It is a profoundly human revelation. True love never packs its bags when the house bursts into flames. It drops to its knees in the soot and commits to the agonizing work of building from the ashes, knowing the real story only begins after the worst damage is done. The lens captures the tragic realization settling into his tired face. Ricardo knows with the cold finality of a grave that his wife is no longer a captive bird. She does not need his money, his soldiers, or his blood-stained protection to breathe. Her independence is absolute, yet buried beneath his ribs is the pathetic, Beautiful hope that one morning she might simply choose the man who ruined her. When his voice cracks, asking where they stand, Alessia offers a hollow, agonizing truth. She does not know. That void of certainty is 1,000 times heavier than any bullet he has ever taken. This is the tragic poetry of consequence. You can never force a shattered heart to beat for you again. You can only stand in the cold, leaving the door open, and pray she eventually invites you back inside. You and I both know the camera does not deal in fairy tales. Trust does not magically stitch itself closed overnight. But tonight, in the quiet of her apartment, a microscopic truce is born. The montage of the next few months plays out in an agonizing, careful dance. The war has ended, but the silence is deafening. Ricardo becomes a man of absolute precision. He arrives on the exact minute. He speaks softly, he wears the skin of the phantom husband she once prayed for at the altar, burying his monster deep in the earth. The lesson here is written in his weary posture. We waste our lives obsessing over the grand, flawless ending. Sometimes the only victory that matters is just dragging yourself to the starting line, showing up today, and proving you can stay. The tension in the frame is thick. For Alessia, this gentle version of the kingpin is deeply terrifying. Her instincts were forged in an empire of lies. If he were playing a con, she would spot the strings. But seeing bleeding sincerity in the eyes of a killer, that shatters her reality. Outside, rain lashes the glass. Inside, Ricardo is on his knees, his massive hands hovering around little Juliana. He catches Alessia lingering in the doorway like a ghost. He does not tense. He turns his dark eyes to her and asks, with agonizing vulnerability, if she thinks he has finally found his soul, or if he is just the greatest liar on earth. Never apologize for your paranoia. When your world has been burned to the ground, questioning every shadow is exactly how you survive. He stares directly into her soul, his face half swallowed by shadow. He admits he has changed, but follows it with the chilling confession that he is a master of deception. He ruled a dynasty of blood, perfectly trained to manipulate everyone. Yet, he swears his chest is cracked open for her. He validates her terror, acknowledging why her eyes hunt for the trapdoor. Then, the true emotional climax hits. He apologizes, not just for the lies, but for poisoning her mind with an endless paranoia. At that exact moment, baby Juliana takes 2 trembling steps and collapses on the rug. The camera captures a vital truth here. Confessing to holding the knife is easy, but mourning the permanent scar you left on someone else's peace of mind is the only true mark of redemption. The camera pushes in as the tiny girl blinks up from the woven rug, her wide eyes reflecting total shock at her sudden tumble. The silence in the room stretches tight. In that singular, crystal clear second, the feared mobster evaporates. The iron grip of the syndicate, the dirty money, the ghosts of his violent past. Every single sin is wiped clean. A raw, foreign sound escapes his throat. His voice physically breaks, shattering the heavy tension as he whispers that their daughter just took her very first steps. Before thought can register, absolute human instinct takes the wheel. Both Alessia and Ricardo lunge forward at the exact same time, their hands colliding over the child. The deepest tragedies teach us this. A single moment of innocent joy has the power to temporarily blind us to a lifetime of darkness. Step with me into the beautiful ruins of a dead marriage. The ink on the divorce papers has dried, leaving little Juliana as the sole monument to their failure. The door clicks shut behind Ricardo, plunging Alessia into the cinematic isolation of the dark. A glass of blood-red wine trembles in her grip as the camera pushes in. She is agonizing over one fleeting mistake. a microscopic brush of his rough knuckles against her skin, and her nervous system ignited. Her rational brain screams at her to run from the flames, yet her pulse beats a frantic rhythm. She despises the gravitational pull of this disaster of a man. We all face this cruel paradox one day. When a beloved ghost returns to haunt your halls, your logical mind and your bleeding heart will violently tear you in two. The framing highlights the psychological war tearing Alessia apart. Her memories have become double-doubles, models, whispering that maybe the devil has finally grown a heart. She stares into the dark, desperate to believe this gentleman is real. But the nightmare flashes back. Standing pregnant at a closed bedroom door, listening to her universe turn to ash, she forces the wine down, letting sleepless claim her. The scene dissolves, shifting months ahead to the first birthday of her daughter. A delicate sanctuary, threatened by the shadow of the dawn requesting entry. She allows it, but builds a fortress of cold rules, granting exactly 2 hours. It is an act of pure survival. We must learn to build walls of absolute iron when protecting the fragile remains of our peace. The terms of his surrender were painfully clear. Eat the cake, then fade away. But the former kingpin arrives early, and the visual change is staggering. The razor-sharp suits are gone. He stands on her porch in faded denim, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of his violent history. He just looks like a tired man fighting for his soul. Clutched in his scarred fist is an absurd cloud of pink and silver balloons. Alessia tries to slice through the moment, bitterly stating the child will never remember this. The camera catches his jaw tightening. He softly replies that he will remember, and the photographs will prove a father loved her. Here is a truth etched in stone. Standing in the fire just to be present for the people you love is the only currency that matters. The feared Don stares down his knotted wife. You and I can see the raw hope bleeding from his dark eyes. The lighting is unforgiving. Alessia quietly admits she wants their little girl to know her father. But Ricardo shifts the gravity of the room. His voice drops to a whisper, asking what she wants for herself. The air thickens. We watch Alessia fracture under the question. She confesses she is completely adrift. She demanded a life swept clean of his poison. Yet here he is, stubbornly rewriting their Greek tragedy. She cannot reconcile the beast who burned her with the man standing before her. Ricardo holds her gaze, confessing they are the exact same man. To love a complicated human is to bravely accept the devastating, dark duality within their soul. The camera follows the balloons slipping from his fingers to the ceiling. The light catches the regret carved into his face. He does not hide from his sins. He openly declares he was the architect of her ruin, the monster who set fire to her heart. No excuses, no shifting the blame. But his voice turns fierce as he swears he is also the man bleeding out for her forgiveness. 2 different shadows haunting one body. Alessia visibly trembles, asking how she can ever trust the monster will not wake up again. His answer is a blade of pure cinematic tragedy. He tells her she cannot know. You can never magically erase the deep craters you leave in a human soul. True courage is standing naked in the wreckage without offering a single empty promise. Step into this shadow with me. Ricardo's promises have burned to ash, leaving him with only one currency, sheer consistency. He vows to anchor himself, praying his quiet presence might eclipse his violent history. Alessia, her voice trembling, warns him that such a pardon could take a lifetime. The mob boss simply holds her gaze, murmuring that time is all he has. He will remain even if her fortress never crumbles. Suddenly, the door swings wide. The party crashes in, loud and bright, sweeping little Juliana into a blur of oblivious laughter, blind to her parents' silent war. Words are entirely worthless in the dark. The simple truth of life is that showing up day after rigid day is the only real way to rebuild a shattered trust. The apartment hums with chaotic life, yet Ricardo deliberately fades into the dim corners, abandoning the terrifying aura of the untouchable boss. The room's tension is suffocating. Alessia's mother offers him absolute frost, while her friend glares as if ready to draw blood. Ricardo absorbs every bitter look without a flinch, knowing this public humiliation is his rightful penance. As the final guest leaves, the feared king silently gathers the sticky cups. Alessia weakly begs him to stop, but he sees the deep exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. They drift into a quiet choreography of cleaning, moving like two ghosts who once shared a heartbeat. Life teaches us that genuine humility means enduring the painful consequences of our mistakes, without a single complaint. The apartment sits in a suffocating midnight silence. Juliana is fast asleep, leaving Alessia and Ricardo trapped in the slow aftermath of the cleanup. The air between them hums with static, heavy with years of unspoken tragedy. Ricardo lingers by the door, framed by pale streetlights, completely frozen. He murmurs that he should leave, yet his feet refuse to move. She softly agrees. He opens his mouth to speak, but she raises one trembling hand, begging him not to add another weight to this fragile night. The once ruthless criminal drops his final shield, simply whispering a breathless thank you for letting him be near her. Let us unpack this together. When you have entirely shattered someone's heart, the only true path back is forged through quiet, absolute gratitude. Alessia exhaled a shaking breath, believing she had survived the night. She whispered a quiet goodbye, but then the hammer fell. Ricardo looked into her tired eyes, his voice breaking as he confessed his love. The careful glass walls between them shattered. He apologized, admitting he could not watch her be such a radiant mother without bleeding out the truth. She tried to block the words, but he stepped backward into the dark hallway, asking for nothing. He just needed her to know his love never died. His soul was simply too mangled to show it. The second the heavy door clicked shut, Alessia collapsed, weeping onto the cold floorboards. We often find that the words we are most terrified to hear are the exact ones that finally crack our hardened hearts wide open. She sat frozen, paralyzed by the terrifying thought of falling for the syndicate king all over again. As weeks dragged on, Alessia did what any of us do when trying to outrun our own hearts. She buried herself in exhausting work. But the story shifts here. Ricardo never chased her. He only sent brief messages about their daughter, arrived precisely on time, and vanished. He granted her absolute space. His quiet reverence for her boundaries was tearing her apart, proving he was placing her peace above his own desires. The dangerous ghost she once fled was quietly rebuilding himself into a safe haven. The most terrifying lesson in life is realizing that broken people actually can change, because their redemption strips away our final excuse to keep hiding in the dark. She wanted him to stay the villain. Clinging to bitter anger feels safer than risking a shattered heart a second time. But dragging around heavy armor eventually crushes your soul. Then, on a bleak Wednesday, the phone rang. Ricardo sounded hollowed out, stripped of his dark power. He begged her to come to the hospital. He swore Juliana was safe, but his fractured voice pleaded for Alessia's presence. A sickening cold washed through her veins. That panicked drive was a pure nightmare, her mind painting vivid portraits of syndicate vengeance. Was it a brutal assassination? A rival gang? Life constantly reminds us that The quiet peace we take for granted can be obliterated by a single phone call, dragging us directly back into the blazing fire we tried so desperately to outrun. Sprinting into the cardiac ward, Alessia found the untouchable Mafia king sitting alone. His face was a haunted grey, whose tattooed hands locked tightly together. When he looked up, the light caught something that fractured her reality. Tears. His voice shattered as he confessed his terrifying father was dying. Understand the brutal history here. Domenico was a cold dictator who treated Alessia like a defective asset. Furious, his son chose love over a syndicate alliance. She never grasped Riccardo's desperate need for that monster's approval. Yet, watching her ruthless former husband collapse changed everything. True grief is the ultimate equalizer. It violently strips away our powerful titles and heavy armor, leaving us as nothing more than terrified children weeping in the dark. The deepest wounds we carry are almost always inflicted by the hands that raised us. He had a massive heart attack yesterday, Riccardo admitted, his voice drained of its dark authority. He is refusing treatment. Says he has lived long enough. Alessia froze, her mind flashing back to the psychological torture the old man had subjected her to. Then came the twisting knife. He asked to see you. Every screaming instinct begged her to turn around and abandon the monster who authored her misery. But staring into Riccardo's bloodshot, desperate eyes, the iron walls she had built finally cracked. "Okay," she whispered, "this teaches us a vital lesson. True empathy often requires us to painfully lower our shields for the exact same people who forced us to forge them in the first place." Let us step into that hospital room together to witness the fall of an empire. Domenico, the ultimate godfather, lay tethered to a symphony of humming machines. Once the ruthless architect of an underworld, he was now a frail shadow, dissolving into bleached sheets. His body was failing, but his eyes retained the sharp edge of a predator. When he choked out Alessia's name, she offered zero comfort. She stood rigid, stating coldly she was only there for his grieving son. Surprisingly, the dying boss offered a weak smile, respecting her refusal to play his twisted games. This proves a humbling truth we all face. You can spend your life hoarding absolute power, but every single one of us leaves this earth in the exact same fragile state. The shadows in the room felt suffocating as the dying boss forced Alessia to listen. Locking his predatory eyes onto hers, Domenico admitted his initial venomous disdain for her. He had viewed Riccardo's choice to marry a civilian as a tactical failure, believing love was a fatal weakness in their brutal world. But then, this titan of the syndicate swallowed his pride and admitted something shocking. He had been completely wrong. Domenico took absolute responsibility for poisoning his son's mind, grooming Riccardo to view his family as disposable pieces on a cold chessboard. Alessia stood perfectly still, completely stunned. It is a profound human tragedy that our brightest moments of clarity often arrive only when we are entirely out of time to repair the massive damage we have caused. Struggling for breath, Domenico laid bare the diseased core of toxic masculinity within their syndicate. He confessed to brainwashing Riccardo, teaching him that a wife was merely a vessel for a bloodline. He handed his son the dark tools to justify his worst betrayals. But then the old man's voice cracked, revealing his true motive. He swore that Riccardo was entirely transformed. His proof? The ruthlessly cold air, bred to bury every emotion, had just spent 3 agonizing hours at this deathbed, weeping openly and confessing his deepest sins. Domenico saw his untouchable son finally break, simply because he desperately wanted to be worthy of Alessia. It shows us that true vulnerability is never a flaw. It is actually the absolute loudest declaration of a human being's courage. Wheezing into his mask, the decaying Don described how Ricardo had finally ripped down his iron walls, exposing the flawed, bleeding man beneath the Mafia armor. Alessia felt a heavy lump form in her throat. Then Domenico dropped the heaviest truth. Ricardo genuinely loves her. He was not talking about the possessive control native to their syndicate, but a pure, terrifying love that makes a corrupted man desperate to scrub the blood from his hands. Reaching out a trembling finger, Domenico begged her to give his broken son one final chance. Alessia whispered into the dark that it was not that simple. Yet, his desperate plea forces us to confront a beautiful reality. When love manages to survive a brutal betrayal, it proves that our darkest mistakes can forge our strongest bonds. Let's look at this final turning point together. "Do not let my garbage parenting choices rob you of happiness," Domenico murmured, melting back into his pillows. Alessia stood frozen, letting the crushing gravity of that confession sink into her bones. After thanking the fading monster for finally seeing her as a human being, she stepped into the harsh hallway light. Ricardo was pacing furiously, his jaw tight with stress. When she quietly told him his father was sorry, the heavy tension shifted. For the first time in over a year, Alessia reached out, resting her hand lightly against his arm. Underneath her fingertips, the terrifying crime boss was violently trembling. This shows us that a single, gentle moment of grace can instantly alter the entire course of a broken history. The harsh hospital lights painted Alessia's face in unforgiving shadows. When Ricardo quietly suggested she should leave, she anchored herself to the miserable plastic chair and shut him down, urging him to go say his final goodbyes. As his heavy footsteps faded, her mind spiraled, realizing his betrayals were hardwired by a ruthless father didn't magically erase her deep pain. Yet, in that cold silence, she grasped how a man could fiercely love her while simultaneously burning her world to ash. We are all deeply molded by the trauma passed down to us, but the true measure of character is whether we find the strength to shatter that mold. Alessia had no idea if this broken, softer version of Ricardo would survive the coming storm, but she felt a terrifying desire to stay and find out. 4 days later, Domenico drew his final breath. The cathedral funeral was a masterclass in Mafia theater. Hundreds of associates in tailored suits crowded the pews, blending corporate wealth with underworld grime in a display of performative grief. Alessia told herself she was only enduring this dark spectacle for their daughter. But you and I both know the human heart is far messier than that. She was really there for Ricardo. Grief is a suffocating weight to carry alone, and she vividly remembered how fiercely he once protected her. Even after his profound betrayal, a quiet fragment of her soul still cared, extending basic empathy to the very people who shattered our hearts is arguably the purest reflection of a beautiful, unyielding spirit. Stick with me, because this is where the story shifts. Standing in the cold shadows of the cathedral, Alessia watched Ricardo approach the microphone. His eulogy was agonizingly raw, exposing a conflicted history with a father who ordered violent hits but also tucked him into bed. Mid-sentence, his hollowed eyes locked onto hers across the sea of mourners. The transformation was instant. The lethal tension of the Mafia air simply evaporated, leaving behind a shattered man desperately searching for his anchor. But she later found him hiding in the overgrown shadows of the church gardens, his shoulders trembling. It perfectly captures the humbling reality of loss. Grief violently strips away all our heavy iron armor, leaving us as nothing more than frightened souls in the dark. He sat frozen on a weathered stone bench, eyes fixated on the faded ink across his bruised knuckles. Alessia quietly took a seat right next to him on the cold stone. They did not speak. They let the suffocating silence stretch until he finally scraped out a broken, barely audible thank you. He knew she owed his violent family absolutely nothing. Without missing a beat, she reminded him he was still the father of her child. He had thrown her a lifeline once, and she was simply balancing the scales. Looking up with bloodshot eyes, he asked if she was only there out of cold obligation. Giving an honest answer felt like walking barefoot on shattered glass. Keeping your guard permanently raised against someone you truly love will drain your soul faster than anything else. The cool night air absorbed her words as she finally let her suppressed pain spill out. She was exhausted from carrying the crushing weight of her anger, tired of bracing for his next betrayal just to justify her emotional fortress. Ricardo nodded, slowly, shadows playing across his face, as he admitted that sounded like absolute hell. She confessed that dropping her walls felt like stepping blindly off a cliff. If he destroyed her fragile trust again, there would be nothing left to rebuild. Ricardo locked his dark eyes onto hers with a desperate intensity. He swore on his life to fight for her peace every single day. Here was a feared crime boss, completely stripping away his massive pride. But true strength is having the courage to surrender your ego entirely for the person you love. Ricardo stood beneath the street lamp, stripped of his underworld armor, pleading for one final chance. Alessia met his gaze with an ironclad ultimatum. If she risked her heart and he failed, she would finally have the closure needed to walk away forever. She dismantled his poetic guilt, dragging him into the freezing light of reality. He surrendered all power, abandoning his toxic manipulation. She agreed to stay, but the boundaries were absolute. They would move at a painfully slow pace, strictly as friends. One lie, and he would become a ghost. No second chances. She studied his face, using every instinct forged in the Mafia, searching for any twitch of hesitation. Setting rigid boundaries is the only true way to protect your peace. It is the uncomfortable truth that saves you from drowning. She searched his face and found zero trace of deception. All she saw was a terrifying sincerity. Letting out a heavy breath, she gave him the word his soul needed. Okay, they would try. This was not about grand romantic gesture. It meant sitting at a kitchen table on a Tuesday night, breaking bread. It meant handling their little girl's future directly, instead of hiding behind lawyers. They were meticulously gluing together a friendship that violence had burned to ash. Ricardo displayed a quiet patience rarely seen in a man from a brutal syndicate. When her old scars flared up, he did not retreat. He simply sat there, absorbing her anger without a single excuse. Sometimes the most powerful way to love someone is just holding the space for their pain until the heavy storm finally passes. When she retreated, he respectfully gave her space. When she reached out, he stood beside her. She interrogated him about his darkest secrets, pressing him on the women from his past. He looked her dead in the eye, the dim light catching his regret, and admitted there were many. He explained how his father's conditioning taught him to keep his street life walled off from his family. He took absolute ownership of the wreckage he caused. When asked if those shadows still lingered, he swore he had buried that life entirely. She was no fool, working her own underworld connections to verify his claims. Trusting sweet words is easy, but verifying actions is what actually keeps you safe. It is a harsh truth we all learn. Yet against every odd, his words turned out to be completely real. Stick with me, because this is where the dynamic shifts. It happened so slowly she barely noticed the iron falling from her shoulders. By their daughter's second birthday, the room was filled with the safe life Alessia built. Ricardo was no longer an unwanted ghost in the corner. He was in the center of the chaos, catching toddlers and moving in perfect rhythm with her. They navigated the noise with the chemistry of two survivors finding the same beat. Her mother watched, whispering about how natural they looked together. Alessia offered a guarded smile, admitting things were better, but grounded herself quickly. She still did not fully trust him. We all learn that trust is a fragile glass house. It takes years to build, a single second to shatter, and a painfully long lifetime to carefully rebuild. The storm clouds were breaking, bringing light back to Alessia's face. Her mother pulled her close, seeing her radiate peace as the shadows of her past faded. Yet, mothers always sense danger, reminding her to keep her shield raised. Hours later, the balloons were deflated and Juliana was asleep. Ricardo lingered by the door, a heavy silence stretching between them. He murmured that he should head out, offering an easy escape. Up until this second, they played their platonic roles flawlessly. Alessia felt the terrifying drumbeat of her own heart. She took a deep breath, stepped over the edge, and asked him to stay for just one drink. The beautiful thing about the human heart is its stubborn strength. True healing begins the moment you find the courage to let the right energy back into your life. Picture this quiet room, because we are going to sit with this moment together. Alessia poured the dark wine, the glass trembling against the bottle. They sat on the couch where she once cried until her lungs burned. Now, those ghosts were gone. They talked in soft voices about their daughter and the workday, mapping a future without sudden moves. Then, his rough fingers brushed hers. The wild part? She did not pull away. The connection was a lightning strike, heavy with the weight of their tragic history. He whispered that he missed this, just breathing the same air without demanding a thing. Swallowing her pride, she confessed she missed it, too. She squeezed his hand, warning him not to push the boundary. Sometimes, simply admitting you miss someone is the bravest thing you can do to heal. "Let us just have this one moment," she murmured into the stillness. They sat rooted in the dim light, fingers tangled together, watching the city breathe outside the glass. This was not some magical absolution or a signed treaty of forgiveness, but it was genuine, and genuine was enough to keep them anchored. 3 months drifted by, and the impossible happened. She let him lean in. It unfolded effortlessly, like gravity taking control. They were laughing about something, their daughter said, then the laughter faded. His eyes fixed on her with that heavy, familiar pull. She leaned into the silence. The kiss was soft and cautious, asking permission with every second. It was stripped of the toxic passion that once consumed their marriage. True peace is always so much quieter than the bitter chaos of our past. Let us watch this fragile moment unfold in the cool night air, you and I. That brush of his lips is no fairy tale. It is the desperate collision of two survivors at the edge of ruin. Notice the heavy slump of Ricardo's shoulders as he rests his forehead against hers. He confesses, voice raw, that he has starved for this exact second for 2 agonizing years. Alessia trembles, the sudden warmth terrifying her. She locks her truth away, refusing to hand over the key to her scarred heart. Reading the shadows in her eyes, he steps away, promising to vanish before his luck runs dry. A ghost of a kiss to her brow, and he dissolves into the dark. She stands alone, fingers tracing her lips, Life teaches us that fear and bravery often wear the exact same mask when we stand in the pitch black. The camera pans forward through the passing months. Capturing a hesitant dance of pushing and pulling, they navigate the world like two victims inching toward an open flame. Across dimly lit tables, shadows cling to their faces as they dissect the absolute ruin of their marriage. They drag his toxic history into the harsh light, mapping the emotional landmines they once detonated. Naturally, they fight. Voices crack like glass, followed by hollow apologies forced out the next morning over cold coffee. Yet, the miracle is that neither walks out the door. Slowly, the mortar of a new foundation dries. It lacks the sweet polish of their youth. This trust is battle-scarred and heavy. A vital lesson emerges here. Showing up to do the brutal work after a fight is the truest, most unglamorous test of love. Focus on this ordinary Tuesday, because profound turning points always hide in quiet frames. With Juliana miles away, the apartment is wrapped in heavy silence. Ricardo arrives, and instead of retreating, they stand side by side in the kitchen. Notice the cautious choreography of two people relearning each other's space. Steam rises, carrying the scent of garlic and the fragile sound of unforced laughter. Later, swirling dark wine in their glasses, the conversation drifts into the wreckage of their past. They carefully dust off the good memories they locked away just to survive the grief. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifts. He catches her eye and quietly asks about their second anniversary. It reminds us of a simple truth. A single honest question possesses the absolute power to alter the course of your life. You and I know how heavy the air gets when an old memory hangs between damaged souls. He brings up Positano, teasing her about her seasickness on the ferry. She fires back, claiming she was merely contemplatively quiet. He points out her dignity was a striking shade of green, and the tension snaps. She lets out a beautifully unguarded laugh. The camera lingers on Ricardo's face. His eyes are captivated. He softly confesses he had forgotten the music of her real laugh, the proof her armor is slipping. Her smile falls. The vulnerability is suffocating. Yet, instead of bolting, she holds his intense gaze. She whispers that she is terrified but desperately wants them to survive. We learn a vital lesson here. True bravery is refusing to run when you are utterly terrified. We are witnessing the agonizing anatomy of a shattered foundation. She wants to believe he has evolved, but her trauma is a physical reflex, always bracing for the trap to spring. Watch the slight furrow of Ricardo's brow as he nods, absorbing the bitter guilt that her terror is his own creation. When she admits the sheer exhaustion of waiting for the next betrayal, he offers a gentle compromise. They do not need to burn the fear away today. That lingering terror can sit beside them as they build a new life. He cannot erase his violent past with empty promises. He can only offer absolute consistency until his peace drowns out her panic. Here is the quiet truth of the human heart. Rebuilding broken trust is never a sweeping cinematic gesture. It is an unglamorous, deliberate choice made every single morning. That is an unbearable weight to carry, she warns him, acutely aware of the toxic pride dictating his underworld life. Yet, the boss does not flinch. He knows that as the architect of their devastation, the grueling labor of laying new bricks falls solely on his shoulders. She pushes harder, questioning what happens when the mundane grind of redemption loses its appeal. The camera closes in as Ricardo strips away his ruthless persona. His voice drops, swearing their family is worth the agony. She searches the harsh lines of his face for deceit, finding only raw, desperate honesty. He begs not for blind faith, but just enough courage to try. As her gaze drops to his scarred, tattooed hands, a profound lesson crystallizes. To truly love again, we must learn to accept the permanent marks of the people we finally choose to forgive. Let us watch the tension shatter, you and I. She breathes a fractured sigh of surrender and leans into his shadow. We have seen cinematic embraces, but this is a darker psychological release. There is no gentle softness here. An emotional dam ruptures, unleashing a flood of starved hunger. It is the yearning buried beneath years of underworld warfare. Watch his scarred hands grip her waist like a lifeline, her fingers tangling fiercely in his dark hair. They kiss like famished souls tasting rain. Gasping for oxygen, he presses his forehead to hers. Offering one last exit, say the word, he murmurs, and he will vanish. The plea for him to stay slip-laps out before logic can stop it. Is she certain? Absolutely not. Life teaches us a vital truth. Perfect certainty is a rare luxury when placing a scarred heart on the line. The camera lingers on her quiet realization. She knows she might never find absolute clarity with the man who architected her deepest trauma. But here is the profound lesson. You do not need perfect certainty to possess authentic courage. Choosing to deal with the shadows tomorrow, she claims him tonight. Ricardo captures her lips again, his heavy presence anchoring her racing mind. The scene cuts sharply to the breaking dawn. Sunlight bleeds through the curtains, illuminating the tattooed arm draped across her waist. For one golden second, the toxic betrayals and courthouse battles evaporate. She is just a woman waking beside the man she loves. When the weight of reality returns, she instinctively braces for a tsunami of panic. Astonishingly, the terror never strikes. Instead, her chest fills with a quiet, enduring peace. Notice how this peace feels fragile, yet deeply rooted in reality. It is not about magically erasing their violent history. It is the raw beginning of a genuine reset. Beside her, Ricardo mumbles through sleep-heavy eyes that he can feel her thoughts vibrating against his skin. She traces his jaw, admitting she is processing the massive shift. He softly asks if it is a good kind of panic, and she smiles, confirming it is. As the morning light hits his face, the ruthless boss is entirely stripped of his armor. He wears his damaged heart openly, finally offering the emotional vulnerability she begged for years ago. He whispers, asking if she has regrets. She playfully tells him to ask again by noon. A simple life truth reveals itself. A grounded, honest uncertainty is always a stronger foundation than a pretty, fabricated lie. We reach a crucial pivot here, you and I. She whispers into the quiet space that she has no idea what to call this new dynamic. She admits her confusion, but locks onto one undeniable fact. Surrendering to him was not a mistake. Ricardo presses a reverent kiss to her palm, promising her fractured trust is enough mortar to build with. The following months drop them into a crucible of tests. Living apart, they meticulously rebuild their connection, gently weaving their daughter back into a unified family. They endure the biting judgment of outsiders who view this reconciliation as toxic madness. But Ricardo plays a brilliant long game, letting Alessia dictate every slow step. Life teaches us a beautiful lesson here. The strongest bonds are forged in quiet privacies, safely insulated from the deafening noise of the outside world. As the story moves forward, the rhythm of their intimacy returns. The tension shifts when her best friend warns that stepping back into the world of a mafia boss is a blueprint for ruin. Watch Alessia's body language. She absorbs the panic with an unshakable calm. She acknowledges the massive risk, but accepts it as her only shot at the life she craves. Has the Syndicate King truly changed? The answer arrives in his second proposal, a breathtaking contrast to their first engagement. There is no opulent restaurant, no ostentatious diamond meant to project his dark power. Instead, the ruthless boss drops to one knee on a lazy Sunday afternoon in her living room, while their daughter plays on the rug. We leave them with one vital life lesson. True, enduring love never requires a grand stage or an audience to be profoundly real. Let us look at this scene together, shall we? The visual irony here is thick enough to cut. The camera pans across a dimly lit suburban floor. Ricardo, a formidable don who usually commands shadows and blood, sits cross-legged, stacking wooden blocks like any normal father. Across the room, bathed in the soft glow of a reading lamp, Alacia turns the page of a novel. The quiet is absolute. Then, without a single chord of dramatic music, he looks up, his dark eyes catching the light, and asks her to marry him again. This is no calculated mafia maneuver. It is a raw, desperate plea from the man who once shattered her world. The life lesson here is written in his trembling hands. True redemption is never about erasing the past, but doing the agonizing work to build a better future. Ricardo usually wears his lethal reputation like armor, but tonight he lets it fall. Alacia does not give him an inch. She demands he ask properly, forcing him into the light. A fractured smile breaks across his face, not the chilling smirk of a syndicate boss, but the fragile man she thought the darkness had killed. The floorboards creak as the ruthless leader steps away from their child and drops his heavy frame to one knee. He exhales, his voice catching, confessing that for 36 grueling months he carried this velvet box, completely paralyzed by the terror of her rejection. There is a simple truth we must all eventually face. True love will violently strip away your dangerous ego, leaving you with nothing but the sheer courage to finally surrender. You might expect a man of his violent stature to present a blood-bought diamond. Instead, his trembling fingers pry open the box to reveal a simple band of white gold. It is the absolute antithesis of the heavy stone from their cursed first engagement. She nods, and the tension drains from his broad shoulders. The camera cuts to a secluded garden in Milan. Sunlight filters through the olive trees. Their young daughter sprints down the aisle, her laughter cutting through the solemn air, scattering petals with chaotic joy. Alacia approaches in a simple white dress, not to fake innocence, but to declare a profound psychological rebirth. It teaches us something vital. Second chances are not about repeating the broken past, but finding the absolute bravery to write an entirely new ending. Ricardo stands rigidly at the altar, cutting a sharp silhouette in a charcoal suit. The stark black ink creeping up his neck serves as a loud, violent reminder of his past sins. Yet, the man breathing underneath those tattoos is entirely transformed. As Alacia steps to his side, the rustle of her silk dress is the only sound. She whispers that he looks terrified. Without an ounce of his old pride, he nods. His hands are shaking. He is haunted by the fear that this fragile miracle might shatter. She holds his gaze, challenging him to make it real. Their vows are not pretty, poetic lies. They lay their blood-stained history bare under the sun, swearing to end the cycle. The lesson is undeniable. The deepest healing begins the moment we stop hiding our ugliest scars from the ones we love. We have all seen enough shattered promises to know when a vow is just empty noise. But watch her face in this frame. She stares into the eyes of a former monster and hands over the heaviest currency of all, her trust. This is not some naive surrender. It is a calculated leap paid for by his grueling effort. Ricardo chokes on his own breath, tears tracking down his weathered face as he swears to earn her every single morning. The moment it is sealed, he pulls her against his chest, holding her so tightly the cheering crowd simply fades into static. In his arms, Alacia finally breathes in pure peace. It leaves us with a harsh but beautiful reality. Sometimes, you only discover the true, unyielding strength of your foundation after the entire house burns to ash around you. The camera drifts through the reception, capturing a scene of beautiful, unpolished chaos. The wooden floorboards vibrate with the rhythm of genuine laughter. Their first wedding was a cold display of underworld dominance. Tonight, the air is thick with joy. Ricardo pulls her close on the dance floor, his voice barely a murmur over the music, and asks if she is truly happy. She gives him an unwavering yes. As she pulls back, her eyes trace the dark syndicate ink on his throat. Once, that mark felt like a death sentence. Now, resting on the pulse of a man who torched his own dark empire to keep her safe, it tells a story of survival. The truth we learn here is heavy. People are absolutely capable of changing their souls, but they must be willing to bleed for that transformation every single day. Notice the sheer gravity in his stare. She is no longer just a wife. She is the absolute center of his universe. He promises to spend his remaining breath earning this grace, and she meets his intensity with a solemn vow. If the sky collapses again, they will hold it up together. The foolish hope of their youth is dead, replaced by something scarred and unbreakable. 2 years later, the scene shifts to a freezing November morning. Their newborn son, Marco, arrives into the world screaming. His tiny fists shake with the exact same stubborn, relentless energy that courses through his father's veins. It is a stunning, cinematic moment. Life teaches us that real victory is never found in a pristine record. True victory is gathering up your shattered wreckage and building a fortress from the ruins. Picture the most terrifying phantom of the criminal underground completely falling apart. Ricardo stands in the hospital light, cradling his tiny son, his shoulders heaving as he openly weeps. The untouchable boss from the old days would rather die than show this fracture. Beside him, their 4-year-old daughter glares at the screaming baby, covering her ears and complaining about the racket. Alacia leans back against the pillows, letting out an exhausted laugh. This frame is perfectly imperfect. It lacks the hollow gloss of a fairy tale. It is bruised, tired, and profoundly real. They crawled through a literal hell to reach this quiet hospital room. It shows us that the deepest strength a human being can possess is simply waking up day after day and keeping a quiet, difficult promise. Ricardo did not just play the good husband. At home, he took a literal wrecking ball to his underworld empire. The family name still carries weight, but he bleached up the blood from the ledgers. He built a legitimate legacy his children will never have to hide from. It took years, but Alacia finally let her heavy armor drop. A decade flies by since that second wedding. The camera finds them, leaving the kids, the car tires crunching the gravel as they drive through the night. They return to the secluded Milanese garden, standing under the same silver moonlight where they first fought for their resurrection. The silence here is heavy with history. A truly meaningful life is not an accident. It is just a long, exhausting series of hard choices you bravely decide to face together. They drift slowly down those familiar stone paths. Suddenly, the temperature of the scene drops. Ricardo stops. His broad back tenses before he turns, asking in a bruised whisper if she ever regrets letting him back inside. He is terrified she still sees the monster. Alacia does not offer a sweet lie. She admits that when the phone rings late at night, that old, suffocating panic still tightens her chest. The ghost of his betrayal haunts her mind. Ricardo looks physically struck, instantly begging for forgiveness. She reaches out, her hands anchoring his shoulders, telling him to drop that crushing guilt. Stick with me here. True healing is never about wiping away the ugly marks of your past. It is about hearing the dark echoes and choosing to love anyway. She looks into his shadowed face and asks the heaviest question. In 10 long years, has that terrible fear ever come true? He shakes his head. Never. She takes a breath, letting the wind blow through the leaves, and admits she has zero regrets. Not even during those agonizing early nights when she felt like a fool for trying again. She gestures to the courtyard, representing the quiet life they dragged out of the ruins. This messy reality, she tells him, is worth every drop of blood. The former underworld boss drops his gaze, his voice cracking as he whispers he will never deserve her. Alacia smiles softly, pulling him into a slow, anchoring kiss that washes his shadows away. True peace only arrives when you finally figure out what is worth the agonizing pain of rebuilding. He slowly pulls back, resting his forehead against hers, the tension bleeding out of his jaw. He tells her he loves her, and the camera lingers on his eyes to prove it. This is no longer the toxic, jealous obsession that poisoned their youth. He loves the fierce, battered warrior she became, the woman who absorbed his worst damage and still found the courage to rebuild. She traces his jawline, whispering that she loves him too, not because he is flawless, but because he goes to war with his own demons every morning, just to be a better man. You and I must remember this final truth. Consistent, gritty effort will always defeat fake perfection. A genuine love story never ends with a clean fade to black. It just keeps breathing, remaining a brutal, beautiful work in progress. The camera lingers on Ricardo, a man who once commanded pure fear. He traces the rim of his coffee cup, his scarred hands trembling. The morning light spills across the room as Alacia enters the frame. She rests a soft hand on his shoulder, and the heavy tension drains from his jaw. They carry deep, ugly wounds from his betrayal, yet standing in these quiet ruins, they are entirely whole. Upstairs, their boy learns a simple truth. A real man is not one who never falls, but one who bleeds to rebuild the home he broke. We spend our days running from our worst mistakes, desperate to look flawless. But real love is found in the dirt. It is the raw courage to sweep up the sharp glass you shattered, and the quiet grace to let the one you deeply hurt heal you in return.